Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. If you love piecing together the big picture and really want a focused, structured look at how the modern United States actually came to be, well, you're in exactly the right place. Today, we're tracing the pretty precarious 400-year evolution of the American Great Experiment. It's this incredible story of massive ambition, totally devastating conflict, and just continuous evolution. We're going to look at how a handful of small, highly vulnerable coastal colonies somehow transformed into a global superpower. Let's unpack the facts.
Okay, let's dive into this. We've got a really clear, structured path through centuries of history today. We'll be hitting 5 defining eras, starting with early coastal settlements and colonization, then the American Revolution, westward expansion and destiny, the Civil War and Reconstruction, and finally the booming industrial Gilded Age. So let's get right into it.
Starting off with era number 1, early settlements and colonization. Now, before we even talk about Europeans arriving, it's absolutely crucial to remember that, long before Columbus, North America was already home to vast, incredibly complex Native American societies that had been governing their own regions for literally thousands of years.
Following Columbus' landing in 1492, European powers, we're talking Spain, France, England, they basically kicked off this massive race for territory. In those early English attempts, they were absolutely brutal. Settlers in Jamestown in 1607 and Plymouth in 1620 faced devastating diseases and these completely freezing winters. But through fragile alliances, some serious conflicts, and honestly just sheer persistence, they dug in. Eventually, by 1763, the Treaty of Paris ending the French and Indian War really cemented British dominance over a massive swath of the continent.
But you might be wondering, how were these colonies actually surviving financially? Well, the economic engine of this early era was largely built on a system known as the Triangle Trade. The colonies produced raw materials, things like sugar, tobacco, cotton. Those goods were then traded for manufactured items from Europe and, tragically, human lives from Africa. The importation of enslaved Africans into the English colonies began in 1619 at Point Comfort in Virginia. That marked the start of a deeply ingrained institution of chattel slavery, one that would completely define the American economy for the next 2.5 centuries.
And that brings us right to our second era, the American Revolution. So, following their big victory over the French in 1763, Great Britain found itself in massive debt. And ironically enough, King George III in Parliament looked straight to the American colonies to help foot the bill. Let's move to this next part and see how this builds, because the tension escalated incredibly fast. Parliament passed a whole slew of taxes, like the Stamp Act, the Tea Act, without giving the colonists any actual voice in government. This sparked massive outrage, which culminated in the famous Boston Tea Party, where the Sons of Liberty literally dumped 342 crates of British tea right into the harbor. When the British retaliated by severely shutting down Boston's port, the colonies united, formed a Continental Congress, and this whole powder keg finally ignited in April 1775 with a single gunshot on a town green in Lexington, Massachusetts, the shot heard around the world that officially launched the Revolutionary War. What started out as a basic tax rebellion by British subjects very quickly became something entirely unprecedented. When Thomas Jefferson drafted the Declaration of Independence in 1776, he anchored the Great Experiment to this totally radical idea that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. That specific phrasing? It turned a political dispute into a full-fledged global revolution for human rights. As we know, the colonists famously won that war against the world's greatest empire. But winning was really just step one. Actually, now they had to build a functioning country. Their first attempt, the Articles of Confederation, kind of failed miserably because the central government was just way too weak to do anything. So in 1787, they compromised on a brand new constitution. By splitting power into 3 distinct branches, legislative, executive, and judicial, they engineered a complex system of checks and balances designed to prevent tyranny. And that's the exact same political blueprint that still runs the U.S. today.
Moving into the 19th century, the young nation really starts looking past its own borders, bringing us to our third section, westward expansion and destiny.
And this brilliantly illustrates the defining mindset of the era, manifest destiny. You see, this wasn't just some dry political policy, it was a deep, almost evangelical cultural belief. Pioneers, prospectors, politicians, they all looked west toward the Pacific and felt it was unquestionably their destiny to spread American values and its rapidly growing economy across the entire North American continent. However, that continent was obviously already inhabited, and the push westward carried a truly staggering human cost.
Following the 1830 Indian Removal Act signed by President Andrew Jackson, tens of thousands of Native Americans from the South were forced from their ancestral lands. During this forced relocation, famously known as the Trail of Tears, an estimated 15,000 Native Americans died from disease, exposure, and starvation. It is a very sobering yet defining reality of American expansion. As settlers just flooded west looking for land and gold, the frontier quickly outpaced the law. A perfect example is the famous shootout at the OK Corral in Tombstone, Arizona in 1881. It's wild to think about, really, a gunfight lasting barely 30 seconds between the law-enforcing Earp brothers and a local outlaw gang became the absolute ultimate symbol of the Wild West. But that single fleeting event perfectly captures just how chaotic and thinly policed this rapidly expanding frontier really was. Ultimately, this very territorial expansion forced the United States toward the greatest crisis in its history. This brings us to era number 4, Civil War and Reconstruction. As new Western territories started applying for statehood, the fragile political compromise in Congress between free states and slave states began to completely shatter.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is seeing how, by the mid-19th century, the country had effectively split into two totally incompatible worlds. On one hand, you had an industrializing, rapidly modernizing North built entirely on free wage labor, clashing directly against an agrarian South whose entire economic model relied heavily on the forced labor of enslaved Africans. The political compromises of the past simply couldn't hold that divide anymore.
So could the Union actually survive? That was the existential question hanging over the whole nation in 1860. When Abraham Lincoln, a Republican who strongly opposed the expansion of slavery into new territories, won the presidency, it was the absolute breaking point for the South. Before Lincoln was even inaugurated, Southern states began seceding. In April 1861, Confederate forces fired on the Federal garrison at Fort Sumter, and the Great Experiment plunged headfirst into a devastating civil war. The cost of keeping the nation intact was astronomical. After 4 years of grueling, total war, which mixed new tech like railroads and telegraphs with some seriously outdated military tactics, roughly 600,000 American lives were lost. To put that into perspective for you, that was roughly 2% of the entire U.S. population at the time. It remains the deadliest conflict in the nation's history, but it did end with the defeat of the Confederacy and the Union preserved.
In the immediate aftermath, the Constitution saw its biggest evolution yet through the 3 Reconstruction Amendments. You had the 13th, which abolished slavery, the 14th, granting birthright citizenship and equal protection, and the 15th, guaranteeing voting rights regardless of race. However, this massive, sudden leap in civil rights triggered an immediate and violent white supremacist backlash in the South, giving rise to terror groups like the KKK, who actively sought to violently strip those new realities away.
As Reconstruction faded, the nation transitioned into our 5th and final era, the Gilded Age. This was a time of absolute contradictions. It was a period characterized just as much by immense, unprecedented wealth and technological marvels as it was by deep, grinding poverty and systemic corruption.
So the crucial point is figuring out how this massive new industrial economy was physically powered. Between 1877 and 1900, roughly 7.3 million immigrants arrived in the United States, all drawn by the promise of jobs and cheap land. This staggering scale of human capital provided the workforce necessary to fuel America's massive industrial boom, filling the factories and building the cities, even though they frequently faced severe hostility and discrimination.
And man, did that massive workforce produce an absolute economic explosion. Driven by the new Transcontinental Railroad, which literally allowed goods to move from coast to coast in days instead of months, American output skyrocketed. Between 1865 and 1898, wheat and corn production more than doubled. And coal saw a massive 800% jump. The United States was rapidly rocketing toward becoming the wealthiest nation on Earth.
But of course, that wealth was incredibly top-heavy. Moguls like Rockefeller, Carnegie, and Vanderbilt, often labeled robber barons, built staggering monopolies and amassed immense, almost unimaginable fortunes. On the flip side, the wage workers who were actually fueling those empires often lived in dangerous, overcrowded slums and toiled in completely unsafe conditions. This stark contrast was eventually dragged into the public eye by muckrakers, these pioneering investigative journalists of their day who documented the brutal, unvarnished reality of how the other half actually lived.
This deep inequality inevitably led to explosive labor conflicts. Just look at 1894, when the Pullman Palace Car Company slashed its workers' already low wages, but flat out refused to lower the rent in its company-owned town. In response, up to 250,000 railway workers across 27 states joined a massive boycott, effectively shutting down the nation's entire rail traffic. It was a chaotic, violent clash that only ended when the federal government stepped in and sent troops to Chicago to break the strike.
And that brings us to the end of our historical timeline today, leaving us with a really critical thought. From those precarious early coastal colonies, through a revolution, brutal westward expansion, a bloody civil war, and a massive industrial explosion, the United States has always been a nation defined by deep conflict, careful compromise, and continuous evolution. Knowing how these highly volatile forces shape the past, what do you think the next chapter of this great experiment will look like? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I'll see you next time.